As Western countries continue down their path of managed decline and controlled looting, the rallying cry, tax the rich, is increasingly heard from both groups of angry protesters as well as by rising politicians espousing socialist solutions. But doing such a thing, taxing the rich, is much more difficult than it seems. The average citizen, largely financially illiterate, a feature and not a bug of the state-run education systems, are almost entirely unaware of the dizzying web of regulatory loopholes, hidden corporate structures, and virtual money pipes that encircle the globe, funneling money to and fro, all for the express purpose of avoiding taxation. Of all the systems devised by mankind, the global financial system and the international tax code may rank near the very top of the complexity hierarchy. If there's a will, there's a way, and when it comes to diverting billions of dollars for the purpose of tax avoidance, there's no shortage of means or incentives either. The international corporate tax system is a network, not unlike a road network, that circles the globe. Multinational corporations use complex structuring, holding companies, subsidiaries, tax treaties, and financial engineering for the purpose of tax optimization, or, to a layman, tax avoidance. Just as logistics companies calculate a shortest path in order to most efficiently deliver their packages to their customers, multinational corporations use a shortest path approach to route their vast flows of money for the purpose of tax optimization. Although for tax optimization, the distance traveled is not important. Rather, it is most optimally passing the money through a series of legal hoops and gates in order to pass go with the most money retained. Some large multinationals may be composed of nearly 1,000 separate corporate legal entities, domiciled in dozens upon dozens of countries scattered across the globe. This all contributes to the phenomenon of base erosion and profit shifting. This activity functionally reduces the taxable base from which individual nations collect corporate taxes. This is why we may often hear that despite so-called minimum corporate tax rates, corporations may only pay an effective tax rate of 2 to 5%, if they pay taxes at all. In the EU, it is estimated that multinationals avoid paying 50 to 200 billion per year by cleverly routing funds through offshore financial centers. Overall, it's estimated that 50% of the world's cross-border assets and liabilities travel through offshore financial centers, an amount totaling $20 to $30 trillion. As regular citizens, we often simply accept the messaging and narratives that come down to us from the state and corporate-sanctioned media. As Western governments have continued to bloat and expand in scope and scale since the end of World War II, the enmeshment between big corporations and big state has only become more complete. The two factions may seem to be working in opposition to one another, but this tension between corporation and state has become more of a linkage, fusing the two bodies into one. Through this unholy union, the government passes tax legislation and policy that enables this system of corporate tax avoidance while simultaneously pushing a greater taxation burden onto regular working people. You can't restructure yourself to avoid taxes. It's merely automatically deducted from your paycheck. An additional advantage of the system is its anti-competitive nature. Only top-level multinationals have the resources and sophistication to play this game. Small and medium-sized companies get knocked out of competition as they struggle to stay afloat under oppressive taxation regimes. The problems that we face in our daily lives, often those caused by some kind of corporate malfeasance, once realized, seem to require a strong, decisive, and urgent solution. And who will provide that solution? Well, the government, of course. However, what we often don't see is what created the problem in the first place. Usually upstream, somewhere in the near-distant past, some regulations or laws were created in response to some now-forgotten problem or threat. When these regulations or laws were created, they were ostensibly made to help protect us regular people. We heard messaging about this or that, how it would make us more safe, more prosperous, or more harmonious with the natural environment. But when this new law or regulation was merely just a twinkle in its father's eye, behind-the-scenes forces, consulting firms, lawyers, tax experts, and lobbyists were already hard at work, assuring that the final form and expression of this law or regulation wouldn't serve the people, but in fact, the well-moneyed interests themselves. Understanding this dynamic requires us to reference the natural sciences, to evolution and thermodynamics. If we focus primarily on taxation, we will find that these two branches of science can provide us with much insight. A country is no different from an animal or a species in an evolutionary sense. A successful country will seek out and find an ecological niche, a means by which it can specialize and carve out a territory of advantage. The International Tax Code provides a means by which this can be easily accomplished. Position yourself behind the right laws and loopholes, and you can assure that a torrent of money and capital will flow your direction. Then, one just merely needs to skim small percentages from this money flow and wealth will accrue. High taxation regimes then function not unlike a hydro dam, a column of water held against its will, accruing vast amounts of stored potential energy, just needs a well-designed and constructed pipe, or conduit, a means by which to relieve the pressure in order to produce productive work. However, this analogy breaks down somewhat, as the financialized work produced by modern financial magic may not necessarily be very productive, but it is, however, very lucrative if you're one of the lucky few who has access to the internal plumbing. In this video, we'll explore the opaque world of offshore financial centers, or OFCs. Just as in nature, a host of creatures have evolved to thrive within this financial ecological zone. Roughly, these creatures can be broken down into three categories: dams, conduits, and sinks. The dam countries build high taxation barriers, increasing the potential energy of the money held behind their walls. The conduit countries, dressed up as well-to-do global citizens, seek to funnel money from behind the burdensome walls of high-tax countries before finally ushering the capital flows to their final destinations, the sinks. Once the money makes its way to these sink locations, often located on faraway tropical islands and protected by confidentiality rules and governed by look-the-other-way regulations, the money even may vanish from the grid entirely. In 2017, a landmark paper was published in the journal Nature by Javier Garcia Bernardo and his team, wherein they explored this murky web of international financial plumbing using big data. When we think of tax havens and tax shelters, we immediately think of small, exotic islands somewhere, perhaps beyond the regulatory reach of our well-meaning Western systems. Places like the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, or the Caymans, mysterious figures landing in private jets on sun-drenched runways, having not yet changed into their linen suits, ready to check on their accounts before being shuttled off to some private beach. But in fact, the tangled web they uncovered was more complex. These traditional tax havens, the kinds typically located on exotic islands, function more as offshore financial sinks, the final destination for money seeking to flee the scrutiny of the taxman. Before making its way to these final destinations, where much of this value disappears from the economic system, the money first flows through conduits, the intermediate piping within this complex system. These conduits are often seated right in the heart of the supposedly well-meaning West. Their analysis was highly granular, quantitative, and sophisticated. However, even macro-level data would have easily hinted that something strange was going on. If we simply examine the aggregated data, the net foreign direct investment, FDI, based on balance of payment, we can immediately see some strangeness. Treaty shopping and FDI diversion is a practice wherein multinational corporations funnel investment capital or the return on investment capital through third-party nations in order to minimize taxation. This is often done through the use of special purpose entities, or SPEs. More often than not, these SPEs don't conduct real business operations, but instead they merely serve as reservoirs for foreign financial assets or intellectual property. As their name implies, these special purpose entities are created to perform a very narrow, specific function, typically having to do with facilitating tax avoidance, isolating financial risk, or securitizing assets. Evaluating the net FDI, as well as the cumulative net FDI over time, allows for a quick way to visually assess the balance of capital flows within a given country. Some FDI can be thought of as real or productive. For example, if it is used to build a factory, buy industrial equipment, or to fund research and development. However, much of the investment capital that flows within the FDI ledgers is less productive, and it merely represents money being shuttled around by corporations with complex structuring for tax planning purposes or for some other opaque financially beneficial reason. FDI associated with special purpose entities is typically that of the less productive variety. Here is a quick example of how net FDI for a country is calculated. In this simple example, using the U.S. as a target country, China and Germany each invest $200 million into the U.S., totaling $400 million in inward capital flow. The U.S. invests $100 million in both China and Germany, totaling $200 million in outward capital flow. The net inflow of FDI for the U.S. in this example is positive $200 million. If we examine cumulative net FDI from 2000 to 2023 for the EU countries, we can immediately notice that the Netherlands took in a massively outsized amount of net FDI relative to the size of its economy and population. And keep in mind that this is the net FDI. The amount of inward and outward capital flows is much, much larger. If we turn to the 2013 IMF data, we can find that around $4 to $5 trillion was transited through the Netherlands in 2013 alone, with inward FDI flows amounting to $4.3 trillion and outward FDI flows amounting to $5.2 trillion. That's a lot of money. And of course, the pipes of this system have hydrodynamic resistance, or drag. Just like the famed canals of Amsterdam, one must pay the ferryman and the toll collector. Even small processing fees, registration fees, and minimal taxation percentages on such a vast sum of money can amount to some good business. If we compare these FDI flows with the nation's GDP, we can see that this is beyond disproportionate. For the Netherlands, relative to its GDP, these FDI flows are around 500% of its GDP. Luxembourg, one of the EU's own domestic sinks, even puts the Netherlands to shame with its percentage of GDP exceeding 3,000 to 4,000%. For reference, FDI inflows and outflows from the US in 2013 were in the 20 to 30% range. If we examine cumulative net FDI relative to GDP size, we can notice even more discrepancies. Here, countries like Malta, Cyprus, and Luxembourg took an accumulative amount of net FDI that is roughly 400 to 2,000% of their 2023 GDPs. Netherlands, Hungary, Belgium, and Ireland are also elevated and sit in the 170 to 250% range. If we examine cumulative net FDI per capita, we can examine this from a different angle. Malta took in over $800,000 per capita in cumulative net FDI, Luxembourg over $500,000, Cyprus $250,000, and Ireland and the Netherlands fell in the $160,000 to $200,000 range. By comparison, the average for the EU was around $20,000 per person in cumulative net FDI over this period. There are, of course, limits to such broad aggregated datasets, but Javier Garcia Bernardo and his team evaluated the global financial network on the granular level and with the help of big data tools. After their network analysis, they identified a total of 24 nations that serve as offshore financial sinks. Here, we show a select group of 12 such nations, and we plot their sink centrality. Centrality in the context of network analysis is a measure of a node's importance within the network. The greater a nation's sink centrality, the more significant a role it plays as a monetary sink in this global system of tax avoidance. We can see from their analysis that the two biggest offenders were found to be the British Virgin Islands and Taiwan. The EU members Luxembourg, Malta, and Cyprus can also be found on this list, where they serve this role within the confines of the EU's regulatory structure itself. If we return to our aggregate data metric, cumulative net FDI per capita, we find that these countries, Malta, Luxembourg, and Cyprus, also had egregiously outsized amounts of net FDI relative to their populations. Despite there being a large number of offshore financial sinks, the researchers identified a small group of nations that serve as the conduits, the intermediaries who help to shuttle this money to the offshore sink locations. Head and shoulders above all the others was the Netherlands, followed by the UK, Switzerland, Singapore, and Ireland. For these smaller nations, Singapore, Switzerland, and Ireland, we find them in the global top 10 for GDP per capita. We also find many of the sink nations here as well, Monaco, Luxembourg, Bermuda, and the Cayman Islands also making the list. Turns out, aiding the transit of hundreds of billions of dollars in assets is a lucrative business. However, the GDP per capita of the Netherlands is quite moderate, ranking in 17th place. We'll discuss later the odd distortions that have arisen within the Netherlands as a result of their role as a global chief tax conduit. For the UK, however, and the final phase of extracting what little value remains from the corpse of the former British Empire, there isn't really any silver lining to be found for its populace. The ecosystem is highly specialized, with each country serving some special purpose within the network. Conduit countries like the Netherlands, the UK, Switzerland, and Singapore specialize in holding companies, while Ireland, along with the UK, specializes in head office activities. The sinks are also specialized, although here it is more murky. In Luxembourg's role as a sink, it primarily specializes in the administrative sector. The largest conduit, the Netherlands, primarily serves as a conduit between EU countries and Luxembourg, Curacao, Cyprus, and Bermuda, which serve as sinks. The UK is a conduit between the EU and Luxembourg, Bermuda, Jersey, the British Virgin Islands, and the Cayman Islands, somewhat predictably bridging the EU with former or current members of the British Empire. Ireland serves as a conduit between the US and Japanese entities and the EU-based sink in Luxembourg. Switzerland primarily serves as a conduit to Jersey, and Cyprus is used as a bridge between the EU and Russian-owned companies based in the British Virgin Islands. If you want to know more details, I'd suggest reading the full journal article from Garcia Bernardo and his team. The citation is in the description. Fully describing the intricacies and mechanisms behind the system are beyond both the scope of this video as well as my abilities. However, we can take a simplified look at the process and evaluate a couple of the strategies that are used to optimize the taxes of multinational corporations. Multinationals can use their various legal corporate entities located in various tax jurisdictions to optimize for profit and debt routing. In this general scheme, corporate entities domiciled in a low tax jurisdiction, country A, will have profits funneled to them, while liabilities and costs are funneled to a subsidiary in a high tax jurisdiction, country B. The productive high operating cost activities like manufacturing, R&D, and sales will be domiciled in the high tax country. These high operating costs lower their profitability and thus their tax exposure. The subsidiary in country A, in contrast, may merely be an office building or even a letterbox somewhere in an office building. The low-tax country A subsidiary may hold ownership of the multinational's intellectual property and trademarks. They then license the use of this IP to the subsidiary in country B. Country B then pays royalty payments to country A, funneling profits in the process. This may also be done with intra-firm loans. The subsidiary in country A issues loans to the subsidiary in country B. The subsidiary must then pay tax-deductible interest on this loan, effectively lowering its taxable profits, while funneling back loan payments and interest to the subsidiary in country A. This is a very simplified diagram, but it at least paints a rough picture. The reality of the tax code is much more complex and specialized. For example, there may exist a whole host of special tax treaties or laws in a particular jurisdiction that further optimizes tax avoidance. For example, there may be little to no withholding taxes on dividends, royalties, or interest payments for intra-firm transactions. In the EU, this country A is often the Netherlands. Prior to attempts made to reform the Netherlands tax policy, circa 2018, the Netherlands had no withholding taxes on interest or royalty payments. Further, it had a reduced intra-firm dividend withholding tax of 0 to 5%. In its role as a conduit, the Netherlands-based subsidiaries would act as the EU-based intermediary before eventually funneling this money to offshore financial sinks. Additional tax treaty provisions would then have assisted with exfiltrating money with minimal tax withholdings from the Dutch conduit to some offshore financial sink. This simple diagram illustrates the general scheme between these three actors: the high-tax dam, the conduit OFC, and then finally the sink OFC. Since the advent of big data methods and the characterization of these complex systems of international tax avoidance, steps have been taken to minimize the base erosion and profit shifting that results from these practices. The Netherlands has instituted reforms to minimize its role in the global corporate tax avoidance network. However, the jury is out as to whether or not it has been effective. Here is an example from a 2024 report published by the advocacy group Tax Justice Netherlands. Quote, "Despite measures the Dutch government has taken in relation to tax avoidance in recent years, multinational corporations still use the Netherlands as a conduit country. Inward and outward foreign direct investment, not linked to real economic activity, has stayed at a very high level, while related income flows have increased rapidly. The vast majority of income that flows through the Netherlands continues to go through conduit entities. Outward income flows from these conduit entities have experienced substantial growth in the recent period, mainly because of an increased flow of dividends. The introduction of a conditional withholding tax on outward dividends is not expected to affect this increase very much, since only a few % of this dividend flow come within the scope of this law." End quote. But of course, reforming such an incredibly complex and convoluted system would be almost impossible. The International Tax Code is an arms race, after all. With so much to be gained and gamed, continuing the spiral of complexity will likely only further benefit the multinational corporate actors. Further, the complexity spiral will surely pay dividends for both the growing ranks of government bureaucrats hired to oversee its operation, as well as the legions of corporate lawyers, attorneys, and tax accountants. With both the public and the private sector benefiting, we arrive at a sort of ecological symbiosis. Further, the little guys, small and medium-sized businesses, will continue to labor under the oppressive taxation regimes, while wage workers will continue to fill the gaps in the tax base that multinationals so skillfully shift and erode. I may be a non-expert, but I would advocate for a drastic simplification of the tax system, maybe even a flat tax. Constructing these elaborate networks and mechanisms of tax avoidance is surely very costly for multinationals. However, under the high tax regime, it is still more cost-effective than just paying taxes. If a lower flat tax were proposed, everyone could, perhaps, just get on to conducting productive business instead of the business of shuttling digital dollars, assets, and liabilities across the globe for the purpose of tax avoidance. Finally, as promised, we'll end with an exploration of the Netherlands and its strangeness. The distortions and financial magic that form the basis of the Dutch economy shows up in the data, with the Netherlands being a significant outlier for a number of metrics. First, if we examine social spending as a percentage of GDP, we find that the Netherlands, along with the other offshore conduits, the UK and Ireland, have very low levels of social spending relative to GDP. A quick Google search suggests that this is due to more privatization within the Netherlands for social services. However, it is just as likely that this is merely a trick of mathematics. The calculation for social spending as a percentage of GDP, of course, has GDP in the denominator. If a conduit country has its GDP boosted tremendously by the role it plays in the global corporate tax avoidance network, it would also lead to a lower percentage of social spending relative to GDP. In contrast, an export-dependent manufacturing economy like Germany must struggle to build its GDP by doing productive work. For conduit countries, they merely sit back and collect a small fraction of the torrent of money that flows through their financial systems, and presto, a large GDP and a reduced relative level of social spending. The Netherlands is also an outlier when we consider wealth inequality metrics. If we examine the percentage of wealth held by the top 1%, the Netherlands ranks at the very bottom. So it would seem the Netherlands does a good job of redistributing a lot of this largesse that accumulates from its role as a conduit. If one were to be cynical, this also enables buy-in from the population. Western Europe is increasingly focused on things like morality and ideology over practical reality. The thought that your country may be one of the central actors in facilitating corporate tax avoidance may be aggravating to the conscience. However, if the money gets spread around and people have a high relative quality of life and a lower level of perceived economic disparity, they may be more encouraged to look the other way. If we look at changes in wealth distribution over time, we also find that the Netherlands, if we evaluate the wealth held by the top 1% metric, has had the largest degree of wealth redistribution since 2015 as well. Francis Wezig wrote his PhD dissertation on the effect that the Netherlands has on depriving developing nations of its tax base as a result of the many special purpose entities that operate within the Dutch system for the express purpose of facilitating corporate tax avoidance. He estimates that special purpose entities operating within the Netherlands assist in the avoidance of 100 to 640 million in tax revenues per year in developing regions across the globe. Besides the pursuit of wealth redistribution, the other central tenet of European morality centers on green energy and protecting the climate. One may demonstrate their moral virtue by expressing their dedication to net zero and eradicating the use of fossil fuels. Here, too, the Netherlands excels beyond the other EU members, or at least on paper. As the EU has progressively deindustrialized in its pursuit of net zero, it has turned to importing vast amounts of Chinese solar panels, those made in, well, questionable labor conditions and under questionable environmental protections, to demonstrate its virtue. From 2017 to 2024, the EU imported 38% of all solar PVs that China exported. And if we were to guess, who has the largest amount of installed solar capacity per capita? Well, the Netherlands, of course. However, despite its dedication to green energy, we find that the Netherlands is one of the lowest proportions of its energy coming from renewables, only 17% when compared with the EU average of 25%, and much, much lower than Austria or Sweden, who boast 41% and 66% respectively. Solar energy, of course, requires a lot of sun, and that is something that much of the European continent lacks. If we look at the Global Solar Atlas's solar potential maps, we can see that the northern European countries, those who have invested the most in solar, are some of the least suitable places for efficient solar generation. This, of course, then requires the purchase of even more solar panels to make up for the inefficiency. If some of the radical proposals to dim the sun by introducing reflective aerosols or particulate to the atmosphere come to fruition, then that would require even more solar panels to be purchased from China. Very convenient for those in the business of importing solar panels, despite this perhaps entering into the realm of the absurd. The average solar capacity factor is a real-world metric that measures how suitable a place is for solar energy. Australia and the US have average capacity factors of around 20 to 27% respectively. This means that solar PVs in Australia or the US will generate 20 to 27% of their maximum rated electrical output over the course of a year. For European countries like the Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium, this capacity factor is only 10%. So, in other words, these European countries would have to install 2 to 3 times more solar panels in Australia or the US in order to generate the same amount of renewable solar energy. Solar energy generation, however, requires a lot of land. Compared to a nuclear power plant, solar energy requires around 50 to 75 times more land to generate the same amount of electricity. When compared to large, sparsely populated countries like the US and Australia, Europe also has much less free land available to dedicate to solar energy. But when you have a lot of spare cash from serving as a tax conduit within the global tax avoidance network, I guess it at least provides for a feel-good moment. Europe famously has high electricity prices. Germany especially has had their industrial competitiveness hindered greatly by the high cost of electricity and energy. It's of course increasingly difficult for Germany to compete with coal-fueled countries like China when electricity prices can be upwards of 40 cents per kilowatt hour. However, if we look at electricity prices in the Netherlands, we'll find them to be much lower than in Germany, around 33% cheaper in fact. Although the Netherlands has increased electricity generation capacity over the last decade or so, unlike much of the EU, the Netherlands largely accomplishes its low electricity price with negative taxes or electricity subsidies from the government. Again, some of that bonus cash from its activities as a financial conduit can be spread around. If we examine the percentage of electricity costs that come from taxes for some EU countries, we arrive at this graph. In Germany, around 39% of electricity costs are from taxes. In the Netherlands, there's roughly a negative 7% tax, making electricity much more affordable. We also see that Luxembourg and Ireland, co-players in the global tax avoidance game, are also rewarded with a negative tax or subsidy on electricity prices. Poland, however, as punishment for its grave sin of using coal to fuel its still developing industrial economy, faces a nearly 100% tax on its electricity. We can also examine this as a stacked bar chart, with the black-colored bar being the proportion of electricity costs that come from taxes. But ultimately, we cannot fault the Netherlands. If they didn't fill this role, someone else would have. It is more, in my opinion, an indictment of the massively complex, loophole-ridden international tax code. But just as in the natural world and the evolutionary processes that govern it, the arms race that exists within this ecological zone of international tax policy will likely continue long into the future. Big data techniques may emerge to expose it, but this just means that the complexity and obfuscation will increase to throw investigators off the trail, and the cat and mouse game will continue forevermore. Or we can just lower everyone's taxes. Anyway, if you made it this far, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel or by leaving me a comment. And have a nice day or night.